So commas are among the most frequently and heavily tested concepts on the SAT and the ACT. So it's really important that you fully understand how to use them. To help you understand how to use them and be prepared for these exams, we're going to look at 5 uses of a comma. Again, I want to remind you, if you want to really learn and make a difference and see your scores increase, you want to write notes. Take notes as you're watching this. Do not watch this like you would a movie. It's an active learning experience. It needs to be an active learning experience for you to gain the most out of it. So without further ado, let's hop in. First use of a comma is when you're listing items in a series. That means if you have 3 or more items, you need to separate those items using commas. As an example, would you please get me some pens, pencils, papers, and erasers from the office supply store? So of course, all the items are separated by commas. You may notice that one of these commas here is in a different color. It's green. The reason why I did that is there's a name for that last comma. It's called the Oxford comma. Now, while this is not tested on the SAT or ACT, I'm going to mention it because sometimes these tests evolve. Though I doubt this would be something that they add on, I can't rule it out entirely. So I'd rather err on the side of caution to make sure that you actually know that it exists. You want to use this comma before the last item, before the conjunction. It's called the Oxford comma. Use it for this exam. So let's go on. The second use of a comma is when you have an introductory phrase or after a transitional word. So as an example, interestingly, the news of her departure did not surprise Robert as much as everyone expected it to. After this introductory transition word, you need a comma right there. Another example, even though Carol arrived at work 5 minutes early every day, she didn't win the best time management award this year. So notice again, we have a comma right after this long introductory phrase. And we knew this was an introductory phrase because it's dependent. How do we know that this part is dependent? It's starting with a subordinate conjunction, even though. So we know that this is dependent. Now, as we saw, if you have a dependent clause, you can have a comma as long as you have an independent clause on the right of it. So let's look to the right of this. She didn't win the best time management award this year. Isn't that an independent clause? We have a subject and a verb, and it stands on its own. So yeah, in that instance, anytime you have an introductory phrase, you want to put a comma right after it, as shown. So let's go on to the third use of a comma. That's when you're joining 2 compound sentences. Again, remember the compound sentences, as we saw in the sentence formula lesson, is when you have an independent clause on the left and an independent clause on the right. We're going to join those using a comma. However, remember the big deal that we made out of never separating 2 independent clauses using only a comma. That is an error known as a comma splice. It is so important that you're going to hear me repeat that many times. Now, as an example, we're going to read this example here, but we're going to break it into 2 parts. We're going to read the beginning of it up from there to here, and then we're going to read from Martin all the way to Long. So Lonnie loved running short distance races. That's an independent clause, subject, verb, and its full idea. The second part, Martin preferred long distance races that are at least 3 miles long. Another independent clause. So when you're joining 2 independent clauses, you, of course, have to use a comma fanboy. That's the third use of a comma. On to the fourth use. It's known as enclosing non-restrictive phrases. This is a very common concept that these exams like to check your understanding on. So know this one well. A non-restrictive phrase is any part of a sentence that if deleted, the sentence would not lose meaning. In other words, the sentence would stand on its own. All right, so as an example, my favorite blue shirt, which I bought while on vacation, is 22 places. Notice this part right here, which I bought while on vacation, is enclosed with an opening comma and a closing comma. That's the non-restrictive phrase. Why? We can delete this part right here and still have a full sentence. Let's try it. Delete that, and we have my shirt is torn in 2 places. Completely fine. So you can see and know that if you can delete a part of a sentence and still have a full sentence, that's a non-restrictive phrase. You have to enclose it using an opening comma and a closing comma. Oh, and I'm going to mention this just in passing. We'll talk about this more later. instead of using commas, we could very well use dashes in place of those commas, but more on that later. Okay, so the fifth and final use of commas is to enclose appositives. Now this functions a lot like the previous one that we saw, which is non-restrictive phrases. Just know that an appositive is basically a noun or a pronoun that explains or identifies another pronoun. I know that sounds fancy. Again, remember, the objective of this course is not to learn the fanciness of these definitions, it's just to understand how they work. So this is here just to kind of guide you and help you look back if you want to, but you don't really need to focus too much on it. Focus on understanding what an appositive is. And we can do that using this example. Now, the noun or the pronoun is going to be in blue and the appositive is in red. Now I want us to read this without reading the red part. Just read the blue and the black. My cousin's dog plays in the backyard all day long. So your audience says, oh, that's nice. You have a cousin who has a dog and the dog plays in the backyard all day long. That's a complete sentence, a full thought. But some people may be wondering, I wonder what kind of dog your cousin has. So now let's read the entire sentence, including the red part. My cousin's dog, a Collie Shepherd mix, plays in the backyard all day long. So the Collie Shepherd mix is describing dog. That's the appositive. The appositive is the part that's describing or explaining or identifying a noun. And you want to enclose that appositive using an opening comma and a closing comma. All right, here's another example. The chief researcher presented her findings at the annual meeting. So if you don't have this part right here, if you don't have the red part, you leave your audience wondering, chief researcher, what kind of research do they perform? There's so many different fields in which you can conduct research. So to remove the ambiguity, you want to add the appositive. The chief researcher, an expert in blockchain technology, presented her findings at the annual meeting. So this helps your audience understand the noun. So appositives need a comma at the beginning and at the end of them. Very, very, very important. Now, sometimes an appositive can be at the beginning of a sentence. For example, a Dutchman, Vincent van Gogh, was a post-impressionist painter whose work is most notable for its beauty, emotion, and color. So again, notice the appositive is explaining or identifying the noun Vincent van Gogh. So don't be surprised if you see it at the beginning. Now, we got to be careful with appositives. Sometimes they can be tricky. And I'm going to ask you this question. Is this an appositive or not? Wide receiver Julio Jones made a circus catch to win the game. Once again, wide receiver Julio Jones made a circus catch to win the game. Let me ask you this. If we deleted Julio Jones, because right now we have commas at the beginning and the end of Julio Jones, so we're basically saying Julio Jones is a non-restrictive phrase. What's left? Does that make sense? We have wide receiver made a circus catch to win the game. That is not a complete sentence. That doesn't sound right. You might see something like that on a newspaper article, like the headline of a newspaper or a news article. Wide receiver made a circus catch to win the game. However, it doesn't make sense. So this would not be an appositive. Now, if we added the wide receiver, Julio Jones made a circus catch to win the game, would this be an appositive? If I put a comma here and a comma there, would that make sense? If we delete this, the wide receiver made a circus catch to win the game. Yes, you see, if we add the word the here, then we make Julio Jones an appositive and a comma would certainly work there. So just be mindful. When you are looking at these questions on the exam, be careful. You want to delete the part that looks like an appositive, reread the sentence. If it stands on its own, if it makes sense, then it is an appositive. If it doesn't make sense, it is not an appositive. All right, so now that we have some foundational skills and knowledge, let's go on and try to practice some comma questions. All right, as always, I highly encourage you to read the question and attempt it on your own. This here is question 27. So we can start reading it from perhaps right here and end right in here somewhere. So go for it. A recent study by two professors at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Chris Wilmers and James Estes, suggests that kelp forests protected by sea otters can absorb as much as 12 times it goes on and on and on and on. So I'm not going to read too much after that because what we care about is this part right here. Now, when you look at these choices, the first one says no change. So is this comma here correct? Suggests. That would not make sense. So let's read this sentence again. A recent study by 2 professors at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Chris Wilmers and James Estes. In fact, let me just pause here for a minute to highlight something that these exams like to do. They like to add a whole lot of fluff in sentences to blur the focus. So I'm going to kind of show you right now how to ignore all the unnecessary stuff. A recent study by 2 professors. We don't care what university they're at and where the university is located, nor do we really care about their names. So if you delete that part and just focus on what's important, we have a recent study by 2 professors suggests, and then comma, that. So we can see very clearly that this doesn't make sense. Notice how we eliminated all the fluff, and now we can understand the question, this sentence a lot better. Let's look at B. A recent study by 2 professors suggests, and then dash, suggests that. So that's improper punctuation again. C also has a comma and then brings these weird quotation marks there. So C would not be right. It would have to be D. A recent study by 2 professors suggests that kelp forests protected by sea otters can absorb as much as 12 times the amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So yeah, so D makes the most sense. Okay, so let's try the next question. And again, I'm inviting you to read it on your own and attempt it. Go. So we are answering question 15. So I think we can start reading from here and end right around here somewhere. Okay, but Jason Box, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State, believes that another factor added to the early thaw. So this looks like it's a comma type of question. First of all, we are seeing no change, but Jason Box, comma, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State. Does that make sense? Can we put a comma here? We cannot. That is correct. That would not make sense. So look at B. But Jason Box, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State. So it's choice B is saying we need a comma here. Now would that make sense? But Jason Box, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State, believes that another factor added to the early thaw. Yes, that would make sense because that's what we called unpositive. This part right here, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State, is describing or identifying the noun Jason Box. In other words, we can delete it and still be okay. But Jason Box believes that another factor added to the early thaw. So it's got to be B, and that's it. So on to the next question. This is question 22. So we're trying to answer this part right here. It says, nevertheless, these tests convinced officials of the value, comma, of using the Navajo language in the code. Once again, I'm inviting you to just attempt this question on your own, click pause, and answer it on your own. Go. So 22 says, F is no change, it's like keep it as is. Nevertheless, these tests convinced the officials of the value. Do we need this comma here? It doesn't sound right because this is not an introductory phrase. Neither is it an unrestricted phrase. Neither is it an appositive. So F would not make sense. G says, nevertheless, these tests convinced the officials, comma. So that's an awkward pause right there. Definitely do not want to put G there. What about the next one? Nevertheless, these tests convinced the officials of the value of using the Navajo language in the code. So H doesn't have any punctuation. So we can keep it there for now because it sounds okay. Let's see if J makes any sense. Nevertheless, these tests convinced the officials, comma, of the value, comma. Yeah, that's too many commas there. So too many comma splices. So then we would have to go with H as the answer to this question. Now, let's go on to the next example for using commas. This is question 9. So we can start reading it from here and stop maybe right around here. Let's go for it. The next morning, using twigs for kindling, she starts a small blaze in the firebox. Again, read this question on your own and try to answer it. Go. Okay, so first choice says no change, like keep it as is. Let's see if that would make sense. The next morning, using twigs. So we're trying to say that using twigs is an unrestricted phrase. Why? Because we enclose this using 2 commas. Choice A is saying we can delete this and be okay. Let's see if that makes sense. The next morning, for kindling, she starts a small blaze. Well, that would make sense. So A is out. Let's try B. B is saying we need a comma at the beginning of morning and the end of kindling right here. So I'm going to eliminate this one here, and we would have the next morning using twigs for kindling. She starts a small blaze in the firebox. So what choice B is saying is we don't, if you have a comma here at the beginning and a comma here, we're making this part here an unrestricted phrase. In other words, we can get rid of it. The next morning, she starts a small blaze in the firebox. For sure, that makes sense. And if you enclose that part with commas, this part right here gives us more context. We don't have to have it. So it's definitely B because it's a non-restricted phrase rule. And that, dear friends, concludes the lesson on commas. I hope you have understood the 5 uses of using a comma. And I hope that you're going to be applying it in every question that you see that requires you to apply any of those rules. Notice how in every one of these questions, we are actually using logic and going, hey, you know what? We've covered this. Which of those 5 comma rules do we need to apply? You have to be able to justify your answer using your knowledge. All right, see you in the next lesson.